Hola amigos! Welcome to another tutorial inspired by the Spiderverse movies. Today, we're going to take a look at the character The Spot and try to replicate some of its effects using Niagara and our friendly cosplayer slash impersonator. This is going to be an intermediate tutorial that will revisit some of the concepts that we learned about in previous videos, like particle surfacing and skeletal mesh sampling. And without further ado, let's get started by taking a look at some stills and concept art from the movies. Here we have him. There's a lot of things going on with this guy, and to avoid spoiling too much, let's just say that by the end of the movie, the VFX get a lot more wild and very colorful, but today I want to focus on this shot here and the effects on it, because I think it will be relatively easy to recreate this in Niagara, and also because the character is a bit more recognizable in this form. In the future, I might do a deeper dive into some of these other shots once I get my hands on the digital version and I can go frame by frame, but for now, let's zoom in on this one here. First, we have a lot of hand-placed elements, like these faint sketching lines here that highlight a little bit of the character's silhouette, and some of these crayon motion blur that we can see here and also around this part. I won't go into much detail for this, but you can achieve similar results using flat planes attached to the character's skeleton. And this type of technique is used a lot on the recent Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie to get that incredibly cool looking hand-drawn style. However, the main part of this character VFX are the blobs of black goop coming from his body. The first obvious bit is that these are only coming out from the black spots in the character's skin and not from anywhere else. But thinking about different types of particles, I can see some bigger blobs like here that almost merge together and blend together, looking almost like a liquid, and some smaller splatters around them. We can zoom in and look at this shot here, and we can see clearly some of these blobs that merge to create these smoother shapes, and then a bunch of these splatters. And another interesting feature, if you think about it, is that these blobs are not lit, which I think adds to the illusion of making it look like ink on paper. And now that we understand what are we trying to accomplish, let's go to Unreal and start working on this effect. Before we go deep into Niagara, let me show you a little bit of what I did with this character to transform him into the cheap cosplayer that you saw earlier on the video. I started with this mesh that I downloaded from mixamo.com, together with a couple of animations, just an idle and a walk cycle or a run cycle, and a simple wave motion. Then I used the method that I explained on my video on how to paint on skeletal meshes to create this texture. Well, I created a white spots on black background version that I then inverted in Photoshop. Then I took the original material that this guy came with and created this simple version, a simple copy of it, where I just have this texture that I showed on the base color, and for metallic and specular I have a constant value of 0, and for roughness a constant value of 1. Without being cel-shaded, this gives us a pretty flat look that more or less matches the look of the character in the movie. The reason I chose this character was twofold. First, if we look here closely at the texture detail, we can see that the texture is not symmetrical, which means that the character is not UV and wrapped symmetrically, and that was gonna make painting on this mesh a lot easier. The second reason was that this mesh doesn't have a lot of mesh detail, and a lot of it comes from the normal. So there's a little bit of detail here on the gloves and a little bit here on the belt, which you probably can see better if I replace the material. And you can see that it still retains that part of the detail because it's on the mesh, but for the most part, it's a pretty flat and smooth character. When I was painting on it, I was trying to recreate or to replicate some of the distribution of spots that you see in the movie, but obviously I didn't do a perfect job. Now, the other thing that you might have noticed is that I have these almost like sketching lines that are matching the skeleton of the character. Now, in motion, it doesn't look too bad, but when you get close to it, it's a little rough. These are made by simply attaching planes, a bunch of them, like all of these planes, to different parts of the skeleton. So, for example, this one is attached to this socket, the right arm. And we can move it a little bit out of the way so we can see what we're dealing with. So we have a plane attached to this bone, so it moves with the animation, and it's scaled to more or less match that size. And we put back in place. And something that you might have noticed is that these are painted on top of the other geometry. I also, for these lines, I created two intersecting copies at 90 degrees of each other, so they're visible without having to face the camera. And the material for this is what makes them be painted on top of the other geometry. Let's take a look. So I have this texture sample, which is just sampling a texture that I made in Photoshop, and I made, as you can see here, I made circle versions of it, wide circle versions of it, and also lines. And I'm scaling the emissive just to make it a bit darker, and I'm also scaling the opacity to make it a bit translucent. And on the material properties, there's also nothing very special. Material domain set to surface, blend mode to translucent, so we have the opacity, and shading model and lit, so this doesn't get affected by lights. It's also two-sided, so if we look at it from behind, it's still visible. But the main thing is if you search for depth, we have this option called Disable Depth Test. Now, by checking that to true, we go back to character, it means that this material won't be affected by any occluders, so it will be painted on top of every other geometry. Now, in motion, this gives us a relatively convincing effect. But again, if you want to improve on this material, because maybe you have a lot of shots that look this close, you could, if I go back to the material, or this one, a couple of things that you could do would be, one of them would be to add some glitching or distortion, similar to what we did on a previous video. But if you ask me, the best bang for your buck would be probably to just replace this simple sprite for a sprite sheet and paint a different version of the same circle on each one of those frames, with maybe slightly moved or skewed one way or another, or also a slightly different color. And I would probably remove some of the circles in a few, maybe 2 or 3 frames here and there. That would, when you play that animation, either sequentially or randomly, that will give you this look of every frame has been drawn, so the drawings don't perfectly match each other, which is what makes it look a little bit unnatural, is that no one would be able to draw exactly the same line and the same circle unless they would be using a computer, so it doesn't look hand-drawn too much. Again, in motion, I don't think this is too bad. But this is all what I did for the character. So let me close all these windows and let's move on to Niagara next. Now, the base for our particle effect will be one of the templates from the Niagara Fluid Simulation Toolkit. To enable that, we need to go to the Edit menu and click on Plugins and search for Fluid. Now this icon here, the tooltip and also the warning once you enable the plugin, will tell you that this content is on beta status and you should be careful about using it in a full-scale production. Mostly because compatibility will not be assured once the plugin leaves beta status. After activating the plugin and restarting the editor, we can go to the content drawer, right-click and select Niagara system. Now we're going to select the second option, New System from a template or behavior example. Click Next and go all the way to the bottom to find this particle surfacing. Select it and click on Finish, and now we can rename this. So Niagara system underscore maybe spot group. Now with this particle system selected, I can go to my third-person character, select the mesh, make sure that the particle is selected, and click on Add and Niagara particle system component. And by default, you should have a particle system component attached to the mesh, renamed as the particle system, and also the particle system selected already as the source asset. If you don't, you can always rename this manually and go here and select your particle system. Now let's compile and save and see what we have. Cool, that's something. We have a fountain of liquid emitting from the character, so we need to edit that and start working on this particle effect. Let's double click on our Niagara system to bring it up, and what we have here is, if you remember from a previous video that I did on this topic, is two emitters. The first one is called fountain, the second one is the particle surfacing. Now let me disable this second one here at the top and re-enable the sprite renderer so we can see something. Now this is a very simple emitter made by spawning particles in a shape location. It's a small sphere here at the center, and then adding velocity vertically in a cone. Then the particles are affected by gravity and have a constant drag value. Now the fun part happens in the particle surfacing stage or emitter, that is not really creating any particles. It's creating this single cube, and it's using the 1 centimeter cube mesh that then gets applied an instance of this water SDF material. And I might do a longer video on SDF materials and ray marching materials, which I think is a really fun topic. But for now, let's disable this again and re-enable the sprite renderer, and let's start changing this fountain. Let's start by removing all the modules from the fountain that we won't need for a while. So we can get rid of the shape location, add velocity, gravity force, and drag and scale color. We can leave the solve forces and velocity, and that's probably good. Now we want to spawn particles from our character, so you might be familiar with what comes next. So it's to add to the emitter update. We can click on the plus icon and search for skeletal to add a sample skeletal mesh. Now here we have a warning that basically says that we are not using any skeletal mesh. So let's change the source mode from default to attach parent. So the particle system will use whatever mesh is attached to, in our case is our character. But just to see something on the preview and to get rid of this warning, let's also change the preview mesh to match our character. Now you might still have a warning that says that this mesh needs GPU access, and it will have a fix now button that you can click to get rid of that warning and fix the error. And next, now we're sampling the skeletal mesh, so we need to use that information in our particle. So on particle spawn, Let's click on the plus icon and search again for a skeletal to add a skeletal mesh location. Now we need to repeat the same steps that we did before, so change the source mode from default to attach parent and change the preview mesh to our character. Now here next to the module it will say bones random. So that's how it is sampling this mesh, and right now it's sampling the skeleton, so the bones. So let's change it from skeleton to surface triangles. And let's do the same on skeletal mesh location. Now if we hit play, our particles are spawning on top of our character. Cool. Now these particles are huge, so we don't have a lot of definition for our character. And if you remember from the concept art reference that I was looking earlier, the blobs are actually pretty small, are less like the size of a finger or something like that. So let's go to the initialize particle, and I think I'm going to change also this maybe 1.5 to 2.5 seconds. We can leave the color as it is, the mass, but I want to change the sprite size, so let's make them very small, maybe 6 to 7. Now we have our character, we can see him more or less, and the blobs, yeah, they don't look too bad in size. This is not too far from what we were looking on the concept art. However, if you reduce the size, and now we re-enable the particle surfacing, well, you won't see any blobs. And that's because this renderer right now is set up to make a grid of 64 cells on this very large cube. Now that means that each cell is probably pretty large compared to the rest and to our character, right? So it doesn't have enough resolution to display all these tiny particles. Now we could increase the resolution, the number of cells per axis, to double or triple or quadruple that, but to avoid taxing the GPU too much, we can combine increasing the resolution per axis with reducing the world size or the size of this box. So let's say 200 by 200 by maybe 250. It will be probably enough. And then let's double the number of cells per axis to 128. And now we can see that something. So let's disable the sprite renderer for a moment and look at what we have here. And we hit play. And now we can see more or less our character. Now we can play with these particle effects and maybe change the smoothing radius if we want to see more individual particles or bigger blobs. Yeah, maybe one, the smoothing radius. Yeah, and this by itself could be a fun effect, and you could move these particles by adhering them to the surface of this mesh to, I don't know, make some character like Venom or something like that, or a water elemental. And that could be pretty cool, but let's play with this and make it a little bit more interesting and a little bit more resembling the effect that we are targeting. I think we can probably increase the resolution one more time to 256. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, so next we want the particles to be only emitted from those black spots in this character's skin. And we could try to do that on the sample skeletal mesh by playing with these properties, the filters for bones and sockets, and the sampling regions, but there's a couple reasons why we're not going to do it. First, I had a lot of bad luck trying to use this, and second, these bones are not going to give us enough resolution to match the spots, because some of them are pretty small and they won't match the skinning of the character. So instead of emitting particles only from the black spots, we're going to keep all these particles and then remove all those ones that have not been emitted from a black spot. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just follow the steps with me and you'll be fine. So first, we want to use a texture for that. So on the particle spawn stage, let's sample a texture. Now we're going to sample the same texture that I'm using for the character. So in my case, it's called Spot Diffuse. And if we move it here, so we want the particles to be only emitted from these areas. Now we're sampling this texture so we know the color of each point. And if we sample the texture on the appropriate UV coordinates, the particle will know the color of that spot. So now we just need to kill all those particles whose sampled color is higher than 0. Let's do that. So first, we are sampling the texture, but we need to fix the UVs. So let's click on the arrow and search for sampled. So we have here on the particle skeletal mesh location module, the sample UV property. So click on that. And now we can uncheck the apply sample RGBA to particle color. We don't need that. We just want to use the color information. Next, let's kill all those extra particles. So click on the plus arrow again and add a kill particles module. Now, instead of a boolean, just the check, we want to do a set bool by float comparison. So this is going to compare these two numbers, and depending on how you select them to compare, A greater than B, for example, it will kill the particles. Now, right now it's set to 1 greater than 0, which is always true, so all the particles are removed. So let's change the A parameter and search for color. And pick this make float from linear color. So we're going to select the sample color from the sample texture module. So, and we can keep the red channel. So if the red channel is greater than 0, then kill the particles. And if we look at our preview and press play, now we only have particles in the chest, there's a bigger blob, in the face there's a bigger blob, and there's a bunch of smaller blobs scattered around, which seems to be probably what we want, but we can confirm by going to the viewport, pressing play, and yeah, that's correct. We have only blobs coming from the black spots in the texture. Cool. Now let's play with the dynamics of this effect a little bit next. The next thing I want to do is increase a little bit the spawn rate. You need to take into account that we're killing most of the particles now, so let's do 5,000 for now. Cool. You can see a lot better the texture. This is that black blob on the face, the chest, etc. And you can see how the blob size kind of determines how many particles are there, which we might tweak in a moment. Next, I want to change or add some dynamics or some movement to these particles. And so let's go to the particle spawn stage and add an add velocity module. Now immediately all the particles are going to try to float upwards. So let's first move the add velocity at least under the skeletal mesh location. I'm going to move it to the after the kill particles, but that's fine. And we can keep the velocity mode as linear, but we need to change the velocity. So instead of a 50 constant value on the Z axis, let's click on the arrow and search for sample and use the particles skeletal mesh location sampled normal. Now when the normal is normalized, so we need to scale that. So I think that instead of a fixed value, we can use a random range, maybe 10 to 50. And before making any other changes, let's play this. Now the particles are moving in the direction of the normal, which is basically away from the surface. So all these particles coming away from the face and so on. Now this looks like a lot of speed, but I want them to start with a high speed and then slow or get reduced in speed very fast. So we can do that by adding some drag. Now that needs to happen on the particle update stage. So let's add a drag module, and let's see. I think maybe I can increase to 1.5, and we don't need rotational drag. Cool, but the particles are still too large all the time, and thankfully we know that the particle surfacing is partially determined by the size of these sprites. So it's as simple as on the particle update stage, let's add a scale sprite size. Scale its sprite size, and we can use one of these default templates. Let's add a smooth ramp down, so our particles get tiny and disappear before getting destroyed. Okay, that's cool, but you might have noticed a problem, which is that, well, we have a ton of particles coming from the face because this spot on the face is pretty large. Actually, let me go back to our viewport, press play, and free the camera. So, hey, we have a black spot that is massive here in the face. Obviously, it's gonna have a ton of particles coming from here. And the same for this spot on the chest. It's hard to see right now with the translucent particles, but we have a lot of particles coming from here. Now, we're using the same texture that we're using on the model, which is this one, but that doesn't stop us from using a different texture instead. So in Photoshop, I took this texture and I made this copy. Now, if you look at it one on top of the other, you might notice that it's the same spots, but instead of having different sizes, they are all the same size, and also they are all very tiny. So for example, I think this part here corresponds to the eyes, and here all the eyes is just one tiny dot. That's for the whole face. Like, I think this is the rest of the face, and there's nothing here, so it's just coming from that little spot between his eyes, and so on. And the other thing that you might have noticed is instead of using the black spots on a white background, I'm using red spots on black. The reason for that is that I wanted to reserve the other channels in case I wanted to use them for a different effect later on. So if we look at just the red channel, we see that it's a 0 to 1 white on black, and the rest of the channel is green and blue, and even the alpha, if we could select it, are empty. And we could use that, for example, as size scale for the particles, so bigger areas emit bigger particles, or if we were working on a different effect, the color, the blue or the green channels could be used to change the dynamics, for example. So some particles would move faster than others or follow different direction, or you can use this for a myriad of effects. Basically, you have 3 other channels of information that you can use to bring information from outside. Cool, so now let's replace this texture by the new one called Spot Diffuse Emit, and immediately there's a ton of particles, and that's because, again, instead of black on white, we have red on black. So it means that on the kill particles module, I need to invert this comparison. So instead of killing the particles if the red channel is higher than 0, we're going to kill the particles if the red channel is lower than 1. And there we have it. Now all these spots are emitting kind of a more or less constant rate of particles. It doesn't matter how big the spot is. And because we're killing even more particles, we can increase this spawn rate even more. Let's do 50,000. That starts to look pretty cool. I think I want to maybe add a little bit of noise, so let's add a curl noise force to the particle update, and maybe 20 strength and 20 frequency. Let's check it out. Okay, yeah, we have a little bit of movement. I think I also want to pan this noise, so maybe 0.2 on the Z axis. Okay, so I think this starts to look pretty good. We're going to adjust probably a little bit more of the dynamics, but I think that next we're going to change the material so it looks more like that black matte ink that we have on the concept art. Let's go to the water renderer and double click on the material, the water SDF instance, to open it. Now we can make all the changes here, but just to be clean, let's save this with a different name. So let's find our tutorial folder, it's here, and let's name this Black Goop SDF. And now go back to the particle and replace this material here. So Black Goop SDF here, and let's zoom in a little bit and let's start making some changes. So we want it to be not metallic, fully opaque, so change opacity to 1, no specular reflections at all. We can leave tolerance as it is, no white water, that's fine. And now base color, we want it to be black, but absorption, that's the way it behaves when light passes through it, and I don't think it matters with full opacity, but just to be clear, to be sure, let's change it to white. Now save, and we have fully opaque matte black goop, which is exactly what we want. Perfect. Let's save, and we can close this and see how it looks in game. Cool, that's pretty good. I think something I'm noticing, there's something weird. Oh, I think I know what it is. So the velocity, if you look at when the character is looking this way, the velocity is going kind of away from the face, and I'm pretty sure I know what it is. So here on the add velocity, we are adding the velocity in the direction of the sample normal, which is fine, but the rotation coordinate space is set to local, so we need to change it to world, and I'm pretty sure that will fix the problem. So now its face is away from the face, and here is also away from the face, and away from every other spot. Cool. Now the next thing that I want to tackle is that, okay, now all this is happening throughout the whole mesh at the same time, and in the movie he doesn't emit these particles from every spot all the time, right? There is some animation going on, so sometimes they emit from here, sometimes from there, and so on. So I think I want to add a second filter to the kill particles module that can be animated somehow. So let me stop this, and let's see how to do that next. We are already killing the particles that are not in some areas of the mesh, so basically what we want to do is to add an OR Boolean operation to this line here, right? So we want to kill the particles if they are in the white areas of the mesh, or if they are in a part that we don't want the particles to exist. And we could change this first line here and search for a boolean or operation, but instead I think I'm going to change this parameter a and change it by a multiply float. Now we can take either of the parameters, let's say b, and put back our make float from linear color, and here on the color let's select the sample one from the sample texture module. So now apparently we haven't done anything, right? The particles are still there, same distribution, still spawned from all the black spots in our character. But now we have this parameter here that behaves as a switch. So at 1 it emits particles, but anything less than 1, 0.5, and now there's no particles. And right now the value is the same for the entire mesh, so we need to basically animate that somehow. And we could do that in a multitude of ways. We could use, for example, the other channels of the texture and have a noise that maybe we apply a sine function, a sine curve to it, something like that. But I think I want to have something that an artist could have more manual control. So maybe the blobs only emit from some parts during some animations and so on, right? And for that we are going to need a couple of user parameters. The first one is going to be a position, and we can call this one emission offset, and the second one is going to be a float, and it's going to be emission radius. And now we can go back to this A and change this for a new expression. Now, if you excuse me a moment, I'll write down the expression and come back and also put in a big WordPad session with a big font so you guys can type it down. Be right back. This is the final expression that I used. I know that for those of you not familiar with coding, it might appear a little bit scary, but I promise you, once we examine it and see each part of it, it won't be that hard to understand what it does. So let's take this line first. In this line, we are finding the length of a vector. So we are finding a length of a vector that is defined by the position of the particle minus this engine owner position, which corresponds to the origin of the simulation, like this tiny red dot here, plus our parameter user emission offset. And then we are dividing that by a second parameter user emission radius. So the first part, this is the distance between the position of the particle and some arbitrary position that in this case is defined by adding some number to this coordinate here. So a particle here will be at this distance from this point, and a particle on the feet of the character will be pretty close to this point. Now, by dividing that by this other parameter, this radius, we're basically saying that particles inside this radius will return a value that is less than 1, and particles outside the radius will return a value higher than 1. Next, we are adding the minimum, or we're calculating the minimum of this length divided by the radius and 1. What this does is now our values, let's say that our origin is here at the center of the simulation, our values will go from 0 to 1, but then will stay at 1 for particles farther and farther away from that position. Cool. The last bit is adding the floor or calculating the floor of this number. And that is basically, you can think of this as removing the decimals. So if we remove the decimals from 0.5, now we have 0. So now our particles inside the radius will calculate a value that is 0, and for particles outside the radius, we'll calculate a value that is 1. That is almost what we want, except that is exactly the opposite of what we want. We want 1 for particles inside the radius and 0 for particles that are outside. And that's what this 1 minus at the top is doing. So after adding that will reverse this 1 0 and will give us the result that we want. I hope that this made this coding part a little bit more clear, and if you already knew about coding, I hope that you skipped this boring part. So after copying and pasting that into our expression, now we press play, we don't have any particles, and that's because our emission radius is still set to 0. So let's say 50, and now we have particles only on what would be the feet of our character. And if we move this offset up, so actually I could subtract this, and let's do minus 150. Now the particles are around the chest and head, and if we move it even further, let's say 200, now they are mostly only from the head. And let's do 150 and maybe 35 radius, and compile and see how it looks on our character. Cool. So now the effect is a lot more controlled and only emits from the parts that we want it to be emitted from. In this case, it's a sphere placed around the neck, I guess, and with a radius of 35 units. Cool. So let's pause this and go back to our particle emitter, and I think I'm almost good for dynamics. Maybe the only thing I want to add is a bit of wind here. So on particle update, search for wind and add a wind force. And I think I'm okay with a constant value, but maybe not that much, maybe like 50 on the x-axis. So let's compile and save. Yeah, I think that looks pretty cool. So I think we're almost done for the particle part of the effect. The main thing missing is these more like splattery parts of the particle effect. So let me stop that and bring this back up, and we'll do that by duplicating this fountain emitter into a second one. I renamed this emitter before duplicating it to make sure that we know which emitter are the blobs and which emitter are the splatters. And remember to, if you change the name of this emitter, to go to the particle surfacing, and here on the emitter reader, make sure that your particle read, your emitter name property matches the name of this emitter. In my case, I renamed this one to blobs, so I just need to make sure that this property here, emitter name, matches my name. And now we can duplicate this. So, let's copy this emitter and paste it here, and let's rename this one to the splatter. Now on this one, we're going to use the sprite renderer. So let's enable that, and now we have a bunch of sprites that match our blobs, but they're hiding it too much, so let's change this a little bit. First I want to change the material, and here for now they're using the default sprite material, but while you were not looking, I made this dirty spot material, which, let me open it. As you can see, it's extremely simple. It just has a texture sample with a 1 minus that is set to the opacity. And the material properties, it's set to surface, blend mode translucent. So again, we have the opacity output, and it's set to unlit. I also set it to two-sided, so we can look at it from either side and still be visible. And finally, if you search for Niagara, make sure that use with Niagara sprites is checked on. Now, with this material done, let's go here to our splatter emitter and change this. And there it is. And now we have our more splattery shapes. But right now they are too similar in shape and distribution and size to the blobs to be very noticeable. So let's go to the particle, to the initialize particle module, and make some changes here. So I think they don't have to live that long, so maybe instead of 1.5 to 2.5 is 1.5 to 2, and let's make them bigger, so maybe 9 to 15, double the size. I think that looks pretty good, pretty splattery at the origin, and maybe less velocity, so instead of 10 to 50, maybe half, 10 to 25, and maybe a bit more drag, 1.75. And I think the last thing I want to do is change the sprite size curve from this smooth ramp to another one of the templates. I think it's called, yeah, the pulse. So the particles start small, immediately or very quickly grow up to maximum size before slowly again dissolving. So we'll have more of these big splatters at the origin before they quickly fade out. I think this looks pretty good. Let's see. Emotion. Yeah. The last thing, make sure that on skeletal mesh location we are not applying the orientation, so we keep the sprites facing the camera. As you can see here, these ones, for example, they still face the camera no matter the side. And I think that's probably it for these ones. Let me see, maybe we can add some rotation. So we have sprite rotation rate here. Let's add one of those here to the particle update, and let's do a random between maybe -5, -5 and 5, and 5, +5. There we go. Okay, let's compile and save everything and check it out on our character. Yeah, I think this looks pretty good. We get some of the bigger splatters here before the particles fade away. Yeah, we can tweak the lifetime a little bit more, I think, and the sizes, but for the most part I think I'm pretty happy with this so far. And I think the last bit I want to do is go to the character blueprint and animate some of these parameters a little bit, so we have a bit more of a dynamic behavior for the whole effect. Let's check that out. This is how I'm going to animate this effect, at least for this tutorial. For a real production, I would recommend animating this for every character animation independently. So during some animations the effect would come from the face, during others maybe from the legs, and so on, based on what made sense in that context. But again, this is a tutorial, so I just want to make something that works and shows how to start looking at this type of effects. So I made a timeline here that has a couple tracks that interest us. The first one is called Offset, and it's a vector 3 that looks like this. Can I expand it? No. Well, it looks like this. And in the Z axis, you can see it goes from -25 to around -75 or something like that, and goes up and down a little bit. And on the X and Y axis, it just changes a little bit between -10, +10, something like that. On the second track, we have a float value that goes between around 25 to around 100, I think, or 80. Yeah, something like that. And this is our timeline. Now on the event graph, at the end of the event begin play, I'm just playing this timeline from the beginning, and once the timeline finishes, I'm just making it play again from the beginning. And that's it. So it just starts playing and just continues looping forever. Now let's bring one of our components, component list, and find our particle system. So get a reference to it. And now we need to add a couple nodes. The first one will be a set Niagara variable position. And the second one will be a set Niagara variable float. So we can connect the first one to the update output of the timeline and then just chain link them together. Now we need to update the variable names. The first one, if you remember from earlier, is called emission offset. And the second one is called emission radius. And now we can connect the outputs of this timeline, the radius to the radius and the offset to the offset. And if everything works as it should, I should be able to compile, no errors, save, and then check it out on the character. And we can see the effect is moving and goes to the head and comes down that leg and then comes back up. And yeah, now it's moving a little bit around. Cool. And sometimes the radius is smaller, sometimes it's larger. Now it's emitting from almost everywhere. Okay, as I said, a proper artist would have to take this and use this or animate this manually for each one of the character possible animation. But for this tutorial, I think we're almost done. The last thing I want to do is go to our particle system and inherit some of the velocity from the mesh, just so the particles follow a little bit along the character. So for that, we can go to the skeletal mesh location, and I'm going to do this only on the blobs, and the splatter lives for a lot less time, so I think it's fine. And we can change this velocity sampling from output to apply, and maybe reduce or activate the option to have a speed limit, maybe like 100, 50 or 100 is probably good. And let's compile, and let's close this window. And actually the other thing I did while you were not looking is I went to this post-process volume and added one of the materials that I made in a previous tutorial. So let's hit play and see how everything looks. So I think that's pretty good. And now the particles, if we move, they follow a little bit of the velocity of the character, but not too fast. So yeah, I think this looks pretty reasonable, and combined with this shading on the shadow areas of the character, I think the whole effect looks like a decent approximation of what we saw on the concept art and the references from the movie. And that's it for this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, please consider giving a like and subscribing to the channel. It helps a lot with visibility and all that. See you next time.